All right, welcome everybody to today's CAI Illinois live webinar. I'm Brandon Stazik. I'll be moderating the Q&A section of today, which will come in the second half. The first half is going to be our presenters today, who are James Cherub and Ian Novak. I'll let you guys introduce yourself. First, a couple housekeeping things for everybody that's in the chat right now. Throughout the presentation, you can put your questions in the chat. I'll keep note of them, and when we come to the Q&A section after the first half hour, then I'll pop those to these guys at that time. So be sure to keep those coming. There's a lot of great information. This is a huge topic that I think isn't on radars as much, that there's going to be additional costs next year thanks to COVID and the kinds of things that you need to do as a result. But what are those little things? That's what their presentation's about here today. And we've got a great handout as well that they've put together on these little things. You can find that in the description. But beyond that, let's jump into your introductions, guys. Jim, you want to start? Or James? James.
Yeah, let's go with Jim. I'm Jim Cherub. I'm an audit manager with Condo CPA. We are an audit and accounting firm based out of Elmhurst.
And I'm Ian Novak, and I'm Vice President at First Service Residential. And thanks for joining us, and thanks for CAI for putting this together. So Jim and I met, and this is a topic that we could be talking for hours and hours and hours and really go into the weeds on this. So to help us, we kind of put together the list of items that for your perusal. But for the sake of this presentation, we're going to talk for the next 20, 30 minutes about, we've kind of put it in these major buckets, and that's how Jim and I decided how we're going to approach this presentation. We're going to talk about revenue, bad debt, payroll items, insurance, a topic that Jim and I love to call new things to consider, because they are new things in the budget world to consider as a condo manager. Capital, and finally we're going to finish up with a conclusion called strategies, overall strategies. And we're just going to lightly touch upon these major headings. So that's kind of the idea for the next 20, 30 minutes. Revenue and bad debt. Start us off, we wanted to say realistic ancillary income expectations, I think, is paramount. Be realistic with the move fees or lease fees or bike fees or anything like that, based on your particular community's needs. We're living in a world where the fitness room could have been a means for the community to make money, and probably not going to be able to make much money on the fitness room as an example. So just make sure that you're forecasting correctly and meeting your expectations, your community's expectations on ancillary income.
Sure. Next, I want to talk about a line item that you would call bad debt expense, or some people call it write-offs. As an auditor, one thing that we often see associations excluding from their budgets is a bad debt line item, or at a minimum some contingency line item for potential uncollectible assessments. So with unemployment skyrocketing this year, there is the potential that associations' collections are affected. So you're going to want to make sure you, at a minimum, look at your delinquencies and see if your specific community has been affected. If you know or if you could see that owners may be falling behind on their payments, and consider putting some type of line item like that in place.
Jim, what do you suggest as a starter point? If you have not had a bad debt line item for a number of years, since 2008 when we were going through the housing crisis, what is a good starting point?
So it's a real difficult item to pin down, but starting at the 1% to 2% range is, I think, it's a fair starting point. And then you can adjust from there. So if you're, the way we look at it is, as we give out advice, is if you're in a 100 unit property, and one owner stops paying, that's 1% of your collections on average. So that's a good starting point, especially now. People may be current, and they might just be starting to fall behind, and you won't see it until the beginning of next year. So
start off with the 1% to 2% as a starting point, but also look at your current delinquencies, and you and the board make a realistic determination
Sure.
on real-time information. Okay. The other on the income side is garage income. For those communities that have attached garages and it's a moneymaker for you, and you're counting on NOI from your garage, I think for those communities, we saw a huge downward spiral on that kind of income. People aren't using the garages, especially in the downtown area. They're not coming to work. And they saw large expenses because of payroll still maintaining that level of expense. And so you're seeing huge negative variances on your garage expense and income. So obviously, you've had discussions with that garage operator, or if you're managing that garage, you've made adjustments with that to fulfill the current needs. Either you've raised rates, or you've kept the rates at the same, and you've lowered the payroll, so on and so forth. But you got to determine that as well for the upcoming year. Be realistic with that income on your garage. And if the net result is a negative NOI, then your operating budget's going to have to pick that up for your overall budgeting purposes for your community. So that's just something else to keep in mind. And finally, on the revenue and bad debt, before I turn over to payrolls, interest income. I think we all can agree the interest rates for those reserve accounts have pretty much tanked, and you're lucky to get a good CD rate. Unless you're going to lock in your money. I think our Treasury Department told us the other day of 10 years, a 10-year CD, if you're going to see a decent rate of 1% or more. So just make sure that you're realistic on the reserve side of interest income. It's going to be quite low, and you just want to make sure that you're meeting that overall expectation. Payroll. Jim?
Sure. So payroll is often one of the largest categories of expenses for a property, especially if you have a large number of on-site staff, or even if you use outside services for, say, your doorman, security, your janitorial maintenance staff. So if you look at those, either employees or contractors, the big word, the big term this year is PPE, right? Personal protective equipment, gloves, masks, sanitation, cleaning. Most associations have probably seen an increase in the need for that, or the desire that unit owners have that the property is well maintained, especially the common areas, the entrances and exits, and elevators, stairwells. There could be a substantial increase in the number of hours spent either with your own employees, or if you need to hire some additional cleaning services to do some deep sanitation and make sure that areas are maintained as expected by owners to keep everyone safe.
I think think that last part that Jim just said is really important. It's really, payroll is dependent on your individual community's overall expectations. What are their expectations as far as a service level is concerned? Also amenities. Not every community is approaching their amenity opening the same way as their neighboring community. So if they want that fitness room open with a limited amount of people, and then to close it down multiple times a day for a deep clean, do you need extra hands on deck in order to keep that expectation fulfilled while overseeing the cleanliness, the basic job description of your staff members? So you just need to look at that. You might need some individuals to your overall payroll to meet the overall expectations. But something else to really think about too is you need to have a contingency for what we call sick coverage. I mean, we are nowhere out of the woods yet with this, and so there could be, you could have to do some relief coverage. And what is your overall plan to meet that expectation? Is it using a third party? Do you have relief people? And have you built in an OT contingency for that? A contingency to oversee that sick coverage. And finally, what we have heard, not very loud from a lot of associations, but some board members, the easiest way to cut back on costs is cut the payroll. And usually payroll is first. Let's start letting some of our staff go, and that will keep our costs down. And that will bring your costs down, and assessments level, but are you meeting your overall community's expectations on service level? Maybe the owners want that service level with all those individuals, and so it'd be a good question to ask your board if they are considering that. And number two, I think even more important, some of these staff members that are community with the communities for a long, long time, and there's a lot to be said with that relationship and with that work, that knowledge base. And if you do start letting some of the staff go, you're losing a lot there. The community's losing a lot, and it's not easy to get that back. So
sure. Yeah, I would
be discussed with your board as well.
Yeah, I would agree that you might have some short-term gain from letting employees go, but long term, is that really the best option for you to do? Sure, but it's a tough issue.
Yeah, and it's usually the payroll is usually the first thing that boards look at as far as reduction of costs. Insurance. Mind if I quickly tackle this one, Jim? So,
sure, absolutely.
I think all of us can agree that insurance costs are going through the roof. For those of you who have gone out to bid or received your proposals from your insurance brokers, you're starting to see premiums go through the roof. And in particular, it's not just COVID related. It's underwriters are limited now with what they're able to insure. And that's driving the costs up as well. We're seeing umbrella coverage go as high as premiums are going upwards between 17 to 20%. We're also seeing that carriers are raising the deductibles. An average $15,000 deductible for a water coverage, water damage coverage is going upwards to between $30,000 to $50,000. So you just need to speak with your broker and get that pertinent information for your particular community, because you might need to, if the deductible is indeed going to go up to try to keep the premiums down, then have you budgeted for that? Because if you haven't budgeted for that deductible and something does happen, where is that money coming from? So that discussion needs to take place as well. If your insurance is not renewing for quite some time, it is important to start sessions with your insurance broker now, so that they can give you and your board a fair warning of what's going to happen in the premium world for your particular community, and that you can budget appropriately.
Okay.
New things to consider. Communication, Jim.
Sure. So when Ian and I were brainstorming and discussing all of this, we came up with that headline, "New Things to Consider," and near the beginning of the presentation, we talked about cleaning supplies, personal protective equipment, sanitation, but there's several other categories with much of the communication moving online, virtual meetings, how you're going to communicate with your unit owners if you're not simply posting notices throughout the hallways and the elevators. So if you don't already have some type of community website or a mass communication system, now's the time to think about putting that in place if that suits the needs for your association. Board meetings being held virtually. You may need some new computer equipment. Maybe your property manager or the board members need a tablet, camera, speakers, those small ticket items that could add up to a large amount of money over time. It's for annual meetings also. Moving them online, there could be some cost involved with that in terms of the technology side.
And not just technology. A lot of communities are starting to look at a full online platform for their annual meetings, and that means voting tabulation is occurring online. Please remember, on the legality side, it's 120 days advance notice on that, and speak with your community's attorney for more details on that. But there is an overall increase in cost as well to use those platforms, and in order to set up your community on those platforms, there's a startup cost as well. So just keep that in mind if you and your board are considering moving to an online platform for next year's annual meeting. Make sure that you budgeted appropriately for those costs. Delivery systems. I think pre-COVID-19, it was delivery. Package delivery has always been on everybody's mind as the packages keep coming, and COVID just made it that much worse. Everybody's having everything delivered, and so how you and your community are dealing with that, I mean, everybody's different, but are you considering delivery packages to the units? That means you have a receiving room clerk whose job is, after a homeowner gives permission, his sole job is to deliver those packages at certain times a day, which is an added cost. It's a wonderful service. It's a wonderful added amenity if you're looking for an amenity with a great white glove service level, but it does mean extra cost. It means an extra body. Package room locker systems, of course, for those communities that are looking at that, there's an added cost to create those rooms and those cages. And finally, package tracking software. You could $10 a month all the way up to however what the amount is, but it is an added cost if you currently do not have a package tracking system to get one of those online for your community. And the price ranges as I said, from $10 a month all the way to a couple of dollars a unit a month.
Sure. And so with increased packages and more people staying at home, some associations are considering the need for more security. Cameras to watch the packages, and in general, not necessarily connected to COVID, but there is across the country some various levels of social unrest and protests, and depending on your location of your property, you may be in one of those areas where the likelihood of that is higher, and unit owners might be requesting some additional security to feel safer. So do you need to upgrade your camera system or or hire some additional security on those times when you expect some event to happen.
But Jim and I put this down just as I think you as a property manager know, because you and your board hired extra security depending on the location of your community. And so it's just a quick check the box to make sure that you've built in that contingency in your budget for 2021 as well. So it's an extra payroll service level. And finally, on the new things to consider, garbage usage increase because everybody's at home all the time. You could be seeing some increases in your garbage usage, and you're seeing that your monthly bills, because you're over the capacity for your scavenger contract, you're paying some extra costs. So, do you need to consider an extra pickup or an extra container? Those are some good questions for you as a manager to ask for your particular community. Finally, capital. The one thing that Jim and I were debating about is this is a topic that we could talk really for hours on. Because of your community, everybody's staying at home, you've probably most likely seen utility usage go up. And for those boards who have not taken advantage of People's Gas and ComEd rebates for low-bearing fruit energy savings, I think now's the time to entertain those ideas. So doing a basic energy audit that's free of charge from the utility companies to come in and find those low-bearing fruit items. There is some upfront costs that are capital of nature, but the savings that you will see from the utilities, it equals out in less than 2 years. But have you budgeted for that? And especially those communities who have not done anything as far as trying to save on utilities, it'd be a good. The next year would be a good time since.
Sure, such as like the electricity, such as the lighting, energy efficient lighting, heating and ventilation, your that type of systems. Sure. Yeah, and the energy audits can produce some surprising results. We've seen some of our associations with substantial long-term savings year over year, especially with gas, electricity, depending on really hot summers and really cold winters. You could talk large numbers that really have an impact on your finances.
Finally, our last big topic we wanted to just conclude with was something that we call strategies. I'm going to start off with amenity expenses. Another low-bearing fruit item that your board members might speak to you about is we're just going to keep the amenities closed. And so therefore, we're not going to budget for those amenities. Swimming pool openings and closings, so on and so forth. What happens if things do change in 2021 and you're allowed to use those amenities, but you haven't budgeted for those amenities? And now your community is looking to you and the board of directors, but why can't we use this amenity? And the response is, well, we didn't budget for this expense. It's a debate for you to have individually with your boards. Do you want to plan for having all amenities open in 2021? And this is just me personally. I would say yes. You should count on the day that we're able to open things up. Or if you're not going to plan on everything opening up at 100%, that's fine, but at least you've budgeted appropriately, so some percentage of those amenities are going to be open, and you've budgeted appropriately for those amenities. You don't want to be caught with not having appropriate funds to open up an amenity, because your community is going to be demanding the day that we're allowed to open these things at capacity to have it open at capacity. The next thing is preventative maintenance, Jim.
Sure. Yeah, that's one area where it's easy for boards to say that they want to cut back on your various your plumbing, your rotting, and things like that. But as you cut back on preventive maintenance, you are also reducing the useful life of the property, of the plumbing system, of the facade or the window or roof. And so, it might be easy to cut back on those expenses, cut down window washing, or cut down some of your roof improvements from 3 times a year to 1. Long term, you could suffer because the useful lives of that component of the property wear out faster, and then you're faced with capital expense sooner than you expected. So that cost benefit, you have to keep the short term and long term in mind when you're looking to cut back on things like that.
There's also another aspect to this. You might be looking at increase in window washing because your community's home all the time and they don't like seeing dirty windows. So instead of 3 times a year, you're going to bump it up to 4 or 5 times a year, depending on your community. The rotting of the lines might need to occur more. Sure. Or staying at home and working from. Great discussions to be having with your properties engineer team. You might need to increase the preventative maintenance. But as Jim said, you don't want to decrease the preventative maintenance. It might cut costs short term, but long term, it's actually more expensive. And sometimes it's hard for boards to see past into the future. But if you have that deep discussion with them, it's going to actually cost us more if we cut back on preventative maintenance today. They'll see it. They'll be able to understand. And finally, services. Something we already talked about under payroll, but you've got to make sure that the community's expectation on service levels are met. And so that discussion with your board of directors of this is the cost to keep these certain service levels at this particular level, this need from our community. And if we cut back on it, if we cut back on those services, is this something that the community wants? I think the community will be accepting to a slight increase in assessments if it means that their service levels remain at a level that they expect. If you cut back on it, it might be a negative result from the community at that board meeting when the board is approving the budget. So it's just a discussion you need to have. Those are really all the items that Jim and I had put together for today's presentation. Do we have any questions, Brandon?
That's what I just was coming back here to start into. So any questions for these guys, make sure that you put them in the chat. We haven't had any of them come into the chat yet, so you have a very high chance of getting your question answered if you do so now. But in the meantime, while we wait for them, I do want to just inform everybody, make sure you know that today's presentation is going to be available at this same link that you followed to get to it today after the presentation ends. So you're going to be able to watch it back as things are, as after it finishes. You can forward this to anybody that you would want to be able to see it. And also there's that in the description handout of a lot of the things that these guys have talked about today. And that's going to be helpful for you as a one-page takeaway, something you can go into a board meeting, make sure you're remembering their conversation here today. And I guess the first thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit more was in the strategy section, you guys were talking about the risks of cutting expenses because there's not many areas where you can cut expenses. There's a reason that your budget is the way it is already, probably. And if there was extra money, it wouldn't be in the budget. And there was the option of perhaps adding some service fees to things like garages or amenities. But outside of that and raising assessments, are there other places where you see an opportunity for potential new income for associations?
It's a good question. Like new income outside of going back to the homeowners for extra service fees. The first thing that pops up is if you want to add that receiving room clerk amenity to deliver the packages, and not all the entire community really doesn't want it, but a particular group does, then it's a fee. It's an opt-in service, and
so a little bit of adding like a concierge amenity would maybe help with that.
Yeah, it could be more about like a per unit type of fee, per usage, or rather than assessing everyone equally. Right. Or based on their percentage of ownership, obviously, for a service they might not particularly have a need for.
Yeah, and so then also with going to the capital side of things, after the pandemic has come through, are there long-term items that you see should be added that may require a change to what you're budgeting towards your reserves?
Not necessarily. And in light of COVID does not mean that your building mechanicals are working that much harder, which means the remaining useful life is that much shorter. I think if your community has not paid attention to a capital budget or a reserve study, it needs to. You need to sit down and do that work so that you as your board can see in the next 5 years what are the upcoming capital projects, and have we budgeted appropriately? Have we contributed appropriately to our reserve accounts so that these are going to be taken care of? Well, I'm saying that the thing that's coming across my mind is everybody staying at home. That needed lobby renovation or that needed amenity renovation because...
Oh, yeah, there might be things that you need to move around in your plan, right?
Staring at the bad paint job or whatever. Sure. And so on the reserve study, it says, you don't need to do it for another 5 years, but the community might be banging on the board's door saying, could you please do this next year? So do you have appropriate funds to do that?
Sure.
Have you built that cash flow report to see if we move it to next year, are we funded appropriately?
Yeah, definitely. If the more people are staying in their homes, they want to see the hallways looking better. And that's not only cleaning, but that could be carpet replacement has to be sooner than you would have expected, or hallway painting, lighting. Yeah,
they're noticing things a little bit more.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, definitely. All right, chat. Well, this is your last opportunity to get your questions answered. Otherwise, I'm going to give you that last reminder to go down to the description. Let us know your thoughts about today's webinar and follow that link to go get that handout. Again, this will be available here at the same link after the presentation ends. And then also, it'll be available for download as a copy, or the Common Interest podcast. We'll be releasing a replay of this as an episode, audio only, of that, so that you can always send it to someone down the line to listen back on.
I think we might have done such a great job. But
It's a thorough list. You guys put together a very thorough list, and so that's why I want to make sure that everybody that is watching here goes down and grabs that, because it was excellent presentation and just a lot of things that, as you're bringing them up, I know I never would have thought of. I live in an association as well, and it's those are just, I would have never thought. So I want to thank you guys for putting on the presentation here today. I'm sure we'll start seeing some thank yous rolling in from the chat as well. So are there any other closing thoughts that you guys want to leave the viewers with today?
I would just say, I know Ian and I talked about it, is just you need to be realistic and aware of some of these changes, and make sure you're serving the needs of your homeowners.
And my final thought is something that we started off with, is just that bad debt line item. A lot of us have not had to deal with a bad debt line item since the housing crisis, and we went through all the foreclosures and so on and so forth. We're not seeing from my neck of the woods a lot of owners not paying assessments. It's the usual crowd, but it's not to say that further down the road we go and people are out of work, it's not to say that we could be entering into a situation where you're going to have some delinquency issues, and with the court systems in the states kind of locking down on foreclosure, on evictions, and so on and so forth, it's necessary to have that discussion with your board to plan for the worst case scenario for bad debt, so that you're not caught unguarded sometime next year.
Yeah, you don't want to be short on cash.
For sure. All right. Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Ian. And thank you, everybody, for watching here today. Hope you took away something valuable as you plan for budgeting for next year. So with that, thank you for watching. See you later.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.